Are people looking for something that's going to question them, or do the vast majority of people want something that's going to give them an answer? And I think that's something it's actually a bigger question, not just in terms of technology, but
Yeah.
what kind of people are we cultivating here? Why are we cultivating a generation of people and many generations of people that are pursuing the answers as opposed to asking the questions?
Welcome to the Digital Rapport podcast. And on today's episode, we have the amazing Bianca Farthing, an educator, strategist, founder, and CEO of AI Edify, where she champions critical thinking and the thoughtful use of AI in education. She's leading important work at the intersection of AI, ethics, and learning design, helping schools navigate emerging technologies with care, creativity, and purpose. So let's dive into this powerful conversation about education, ethics, and the future of AI. So welcome, Bianca.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So Bianca, as we normally start this podcast, is like, what does rapport mean to you?
So when I think about rapport, it's all about having a relationship, a supportive relationship, something that is very much based on a sense of community, on a sense of values and shared values. So when I think of rapport, it's very much about support for me.
About support. Okay, fantastic. Cool. So okay, let's get into this topic. The stuff you're doing is amazing. I don't think enough people are really talking about it. But what I find interesting is that your background was history, right? You were a history teacher originally, and you've gone from history into pretty much future tech with AI and education. How did that come about?
See, I actually think that when it comes to being a history teacher, I think that gives a very niche set of skills that actually really helps when it comes to digital technology. So when we're thinking about the historical skills you'd have, so analyzing source materials and evaluating the reliability of them and looking at, why they were made and what the purpose was, and the impact they have. That's exactly the same when we think about using AI. It's all about evaluating the material. It's about curating. It's about, thoroughly and robustly investigating it. And that's something that, as a history teacher, you would do. And also, if we think about the instructional element of AI, so when we think about prompt craft, for example, teachers are actually very well placed because they spend their entire days trying to explain in a number of different ways material to pupils. So therefore, by nature, they are experts in instructional activity, which very well allows itself to prompt craft, as it were.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I suppose like just the whole element of history, seeing where things have gone wrong, we could take that as well, actually, we don't want to go down a path like this. If we utilize, if we understand the best of that and put it into the future, then we can actually get into a better space. I think one of the reasons why this is so important is because at this moment in time, like everybody's concerned about AI, right? Like people are just worried that this might happen, that might happen. But what you're doing is you're going a step beyond that because you're looking at the next generation. You're looking at how AI, because we can't get away from it, this technology is going to be a part of everything we do now, right? But you're looking at it from a perspective of, well, okay, we're there now. So how do we utilize this in the best possible way for both students as well as teachers, right?
Yeah, I think very much because when we think about student use, for example, students are using it. So there's quite a few studies where they have cited between 40% and even 80% of pupil use in various different studies. So ultimately, as educators, we need to evolve. So whether we choose to use it in our own practice, that's a different issue. But we need to understand that this is a tool and also in some areas a danger that's being presented to young people. So teachers need to be able to, if they don't use it in their practice, they need to have enough understanding that they know how pupils are using it and how to address that. And also when we think about the skills that pupils will then need when it comes to later work, the education system also needs to evolve as well, because now there are jobs out there which, I didn't go to school that long ago, but that never existed when I was at school. And so we need to be evolving and adapting to that.
Right. And if we look at what's happening currently, like what are some of the, I suppose, things, how, let's look at the students first. What are they doing? Then we move over to what the teachers are doing. Like what's happening in that space? Or how are you students utilizing AI? What's going on? Where's the challenges or even the possibility of creation for them? Like what's going on with them at the moment?
I think one of the biggest challenges is actually most pupils and children in general, they start with AI being a social companion. So applications such as Snapchat have their own AI chatbots. So Snapchat's My AI, for example. And in that, it's being framed very much as a companion and someone they're able to talk to, they're able to get advice from. But that is very concerning for two parts. First of which is general safety, because Snapchat themselves openly say that they cannot guarantee that the material that it produces is age appropriate. So to me, something shouldn't actually be marketed to children if it's not age appropriate. And secondly, there's an issue there where AI is framed first and foremost as a social tool, so that when it's taught later in schools, if and when it is, it means that you have to unpick the, embedded relationship that they have with AI to then reframe it also as a learning tool. And so when we think about learning as well, there are some, of course, responsible use that children are doing. So some might use it as an online tutor, for example, which is, a very useful way of doing it, or helping them draft things. But there are also children who are using it for cheating. And some might be doing that without realizing. There's quite a blur now between cheating, plagiarism, academic dishonesty, and actually just a normal workflow. And so children are struggling to identify what that means. And also, it's the same with teachers. What does cheating look like now? If you go onto AI and say, can you help me brainstorm? Is that cheating? If you help them draft an essay, is that cheating? There aren't any, there's not guidance there. And so children are using it in a lot of different ways. And then we also have the same with teachers. And I think adults as general, there's such a huge disparity. So some people might use it as a Google, for example, where they just put in anything they fancy. Others will use it as a coach. Others might use it as their online doctor, which, again, need to seek medical actual assistance, but some people aren't. They're seeing it as an answer generator. And that's what's concerning, is there's no universal use case for AI. People are applying it exploratory to what they're doing.
Because that is one of the spaces you're working on, is that how is AI being used in that kind of ethical purpose. We'll come back to that a bit more because that's kind of deep anyway. So as a teacher, like you've alluded to it, like people are using it for essays, they're using it for brainstorming and things like that. Where do you feel, you mentioned some of the negative stuff, or where do you feel some of the positive stuffs are coming out of it as well?
I think in terms of positive, I think there's a lot of opportunity to augment your practice. So whether that's for children or for adults, if I look at how I use it, for example, it can streamline my processes. Also, I use it to interrogate me. So if I create something, I can put it in and say, what are my underlying biases here? What are my assumptions? What have I not thought of? So using it to stretch and challenge is really valuable. And if children are able to use that and put something in and say, this is what I think, can you challenge me on this? What
Mm.
evidence is there? What can we suggest that's different? That could create a whole host of young people that are actually far more critical in their thinking than we would have necessarily been at school. So I think from there is a tool, but it's about framing it properly and using it properly. And unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of the framing around AI is all about efficiency. And
Mm.
so because of that, efficiency, unfortunately, leads to shallow learning.
Yeah.
And that's where the problem is. And so I'm a completely an advocate for AI when it is to promote deep learning. But I think currently we are in a cycle of efficiency savings, which by proxy will just be shallow learning and breadth as opposed to any depth.
Yeah, yeah. I get where you're coming from in regards to that, because it's like, if I look at it, how I use it, I might have drafted an email and then I'll go to it and say, just make this better or tweak it, get rid of the issues or problems, and then it just rewords it and puts it away. So it's still using my context, but makes it better. And one of the things I found is, by doing that, it's actually improved the way I write emails, because I thought, okay, that's a nice way to do it. That's a better way. So next time when I craft an email or something, this is just one example, it's actually better, and then it just tweaks it a little bit, right? Now, one of the other things that you mentioned is that the trust factor with the AI. What I've noticed is that you might put something in there and it kind of just agrees with you. Like, what you default, like, yeah, that's a good idea. This and if you have if you're not, like you say, if you're not challenged on the thinking and it's kind of agreeing with you, then it's going to make the students think that they're doing the right thing and that this is actually right when it's not. Um, how do you think the tech companies can address things like that? Because I mean, people are using it, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think how they could address it, I think is very different in terms of how they're going to address it. Because ultimately, I think by creating a system that challenges its users actually isn't particularly good marketing. And by that, I mean they want to have users that stay on their platforms. And so by having a interface which responds with pleasing responses and an echo chamber, as it were, they're
Mm,
keeping that engagement going because that's what it is. They need this engagement. And so to by constantly challenging people, that may actually make them switch off and think this is not something I want to interact with. So therefore, I don't actually think I think if in an ideal world, what I'd like to see is a interface which basically looks at bias, that can look at implicit assumptions, that can question itself, that can say, this is a possibility or this is a possibility and give choices in its responses. That doesn't sound so certain because ultimately it shouldn't sound so certain. That's what I'd like to see, but that's not what's going to happen because ultimately that's not what's going to keep users on
yeah.
on a wide scale on their platform. And so because of that, I think we all need to be aware, just like when we think about social media, you know, algorithms are there and they want to keep engagement as long as possible. And so when it comes to big tech companies, that's what they want from its users. And unfortunately, that means curating a sphere in which you have an echo chamber of pleasing responses, which is very dangerous for young people and adults, but especially for young people, because they haven't yet had a lifetime to evaluate what a good or problematic output might be.
Exactly, exactly. It was interesting because the other day I was having a conversation with a negotiation expert who's looking at AI and negotiation, and he told me about agreement algorithms, which I hadn't heard about before. So the agreement algorithms are supposed to be designed to kind of come to some sort of agreement with, like, when you're doing negotiation in various different factors. But it looks like that the AI is kind of using those agreement algorithms at the moment to kind of be in alignment with you, right? Which is a very interesting take on things because what it looks like is going to happen, it may or may not, is that you're going to have more of the kind of general kind of stuff, which is like the chat GPTs and stuff like that. But then you're going to get people creating AIs that are for a particular niche and a particular way of doing things, which is where you're heading with what you're doing with the AI and education, because you are exactly looking at it from that eye. So, okay, we've got AI, but how do we configure it for education purposes, right? So, let's go back to the teachers quickly as well, and then we'll go back to some of the stuff you're working on. So, what are the teachers kind of seeing? What are they I suppose, what they're struggling with at the moment? And yeah, how could what you're doing at the moment is helping them as well?
I think
I
in
don't know if you
terms
got
of
any
what
question there.
teachers are seeing at the moment, I think a lot of what they're seeing is a disparity of use with both young people and themselves. A lot of training sessions that, often are quite general, which is unhelpful. And also, if you think about all teachers, teachers are time poor.
Mm,
They work such long hours and they have so much work. Their workload in teaching is incredibly high. And so when we think of AI, just training on that is another thing that teachers then have to do. And
mm,
so it's a huge struggle. And especially when now you might be faced with an essay where you don't even know if it's generated or created anymore.
mm,
And so there's a lot to grapple with. And as well as that, there's not fixed guidelines of how it should be used. There's no fixed government guidelines or in terms of everything seems a research phase at the moment, and that will then make it tricky. So that's very much why we do what we do, which is looking at things like consulting, having an actual AI toolkit, so things like lesson planners, for example, but that give you options. Because actually, I truly believe that AI should not be an answer generator. I don't want it to respond with, "I would like a lesson plan. Here you go and teach it." That's not what's going to work for me because no one knows the pupils in my classroom like me. And
Mm,
that's the same with all the teachers. And so using AI to give you options instead of answers still allows you to enact that teacher agency. And that's what's so important. And unfortunately, AI is also being coined with the concept of replacement. But
mm,
I'm a firm believer that you can't replace teachers. If you give them tools at their disposal to make them, augment their practice and support them, that's fantastic. But there shouldn't be a replacement element of it. And that's where, we've very much digressed in terms of it being an answer generator to actually, how can we support educators here? And how do I distill how I would love to teach into tools?
See, that's one of the things when we've had like a conversation in the past. That was one of the things I really loved about your way of thinking, because what you mentioned was your interaction with your students in the classroom, like what's going on with them, their kind of emotional states and where they are. And in looking at that, you're able to adapt the way you teach in that scenario. And you're right, you can't kind of put that through an AI because it's just you don't want it to give you answers. But if you put various options in to say this is what's going on to give you some idea, then you could try different things. So that heart-centered approach, that very human-centric kind of way you're looking at it is, I think, is phenomenal, right? And even on the teacher side, because you're looking at it from, well, actually, what's going on with the teachers? How are they trying to keep up with the tech and understand what's going on? What are some of the things that teachers are scared of, and what are they doing to kind of, I suppose, up their skill level, I suppose?
I think in terms of what they're more scared of and more concerned about, I think plagiarism is one of the biggest ones. And I think that's just because, we now have a system in which we don't really know what plagiarism looks like. It's not a clear case. So you might have different tasks where cheating looks different and academic dishonesty is different to in another subject or in another year group or in another exam board or everything like that. It is very difficult now because we don't have that regulation, it's a bit of a struggle to see what is allowed and what's not. And also, because this is very new, it's very difficult to see what the impacts on the learners are. So, of course, schools want to be very innovative and teachers want to be innovative in the way that they're doing things, but we don't yet know what the impact would be. So, for example, if we replace elements of essay writing, let's say, because that's something that we know that ChatGPT can do. But if we replace that, are we then removing the processes to enable deep learning, such as it's because it's not actually the output, but the creation of the essay and bringing together that understanding by doing less essays? Are we going to actually impact that understanding? Will they still have real understanding? And so that's where it's difficult, is I think people are very concerned about how we're going to adapt and the long-term impact that might have on our learners.
Exactly, because at the moment it's a very very gray area because it's like you said, there's no regulation in place. Governments are looking at what they could potentially do. Yeah, exactly what you said. What's the impact on students on how they is it gonna are they one of the things I came across once was like the quality of your life is dependent on the quality of your questions, right? I think it was a guy called Dr. John DiMartino who mentioned that, where I heard it from anyway. And I thought that's such a interesting thing to apply because even with AI, the quality of the output is depending on the quality of the question you put in there. And if people don't know how to think like that, then it's the AI is kind of just gonna give you input output kind of process. It's got nothing more than that. So what you're alluding to there about the like kind of creativity side of it is how does it impact that side of it? Share a bit more about that because I think that's very important for people to understand that they can't just use AI just to give you an answer, but what can they do to get more creative?
So, for example, if you use your own mind as a starting point, there's one thing that I'm a bit troubled with in terms of idea generation. So, once you ask AI for an idea, it's already there. You've already read it. You can't unsee it. So then it's already guiding you. So my view would be you start with the person, you start with your own ideas, and then you use it to refine and ask you questions on it. So, for example, if I came up with three ideas, I could then use AI to interrogate me and ask me questions on those three ideas, and then I can then unpick. Because also there needs to be a kind of a boundary line between adulthood and childhood when it comes to this, because we also need to understand that adults are able to be more creative in different ways with AI because they have that bank of knowledge and life experience that allows them to curate, create these ideas, but also evaluate them based on lived experience. And we
Mm.
need to understand that children don't have that same bank of knowledge, they don't have that same contextual awareness. So their creativity will of course, potentially be much more creative because it has less of these boundaries, but also it means it has less of this contextual understanding to be able to evaluate. So to me, it's all about you start with the person, then you use AI to interrogate, to find your way through, to question you so that you can really understand what your thinking is, what your position is, and actually think, oh, maybe I shouldn't go with that. Maybe I should go with something else because I hadn't thought about that question.
Exactly. That just reminds me when I was doing my dissertation at uni, when I went to my supervisor, every time I would go up to the supervisor with a problem, I say, I got this problem, and she'll turn around and she'll say, well, what do you think? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm coming to you, the teacher. You should know, innit? And I go, tell me the answer. And she go, no, but what do you think? And I'm like, I don't know. And she'll do that a few times. And then I'll kick in the thing, actually, what do I think? What could happen? And I'll just come up with some ideas and thoughts and then end up answering my own question. This would happen every single time, right? Every single time. One day, I was at home and I got stuck with something, and I was working on the dissertation. I thought, okay, I'm gonna go to see the supervisor. And I'm sitting there, and I hear her voice in my head saying, "Well, Jatinder, what do you think?" And I thought, oh, and I ended up answering my own question. But that was on something that the teacher taught me, right? Because of, like you said, lived experience and get exactly what you've just said. Like if the AI was able to do that kind of thing, would be way more powerful, right?
Yeah, I think it would be, but I suppose it's also looking at how many people would then necessarily engage with it. Because are people looking for something that's going to question them, or do the vast majority of people want something that's going to give them an answer? And I think that's something it's actually a bigger question, not just in terms of technology, but
Yeah.
what kind of people are we cultivating here? Why are we cultivating a generation of people and many generations of people that are pursuing the answers as opposed to asking the questions?
Exactly. And what you just said there, just that nails it, because that's the core of the human well, wisdom, I suppose, right? The teacher being able to do that in that kind of thing at the right time. You know, when you look, she looks at you, so you see what's going on, there's body language, all that kind of stuff, and says, actually, this is what he needed at that time is to do this. Whereas the AI can't do that. And you've just said, and you know, by letting the AI do that, what's going on in that scenario? So that's very deep thinking. That is. I'm glad you've kind of mentioned that. How far away do you think we are from those scenes we see in the movies where you walk into a classroom and the students are sitting there and there's just the AI teaching them?
I'm hoping that that will never happen. And the reason for that is, in terms of how far away, I think children need to learn also with a champion there for them. When we think about AI, we're thinking about outputs, we're thinking about metrics, we're thinking about what the end result should look like. But it's missing the point in terms of a lot of the time when you think back to your own education, you don't think about, you might think about your grades to an extent, but you don't think about all your assessments, you don't think about your learning processes. You think about the people, you think about your teachers, you think about your friends, you think about your experience. And that impacts how you think about education. And as well as that, in the classroom, teachers and pupils have a really strong relationship, and often pupils want to please their teachers. They want to do well because, it might be their favorite teacher, for example, or they know that their teacher will be proud of them. And a teacher has a role there, not just to get them to the end point and that assessment, but to also be supportive, to curate these young people and to show them that they're proud of them, to create that human element of it. And AI can't do that because if you think about it, if I were to write an essay as a child and I could have an AI response saying, "That's amazing, I'm really proud of you." What does that
Like
mean? Will that have the same impact as a person?
being the child, right? Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things why we won't necessarily have an AI in the classroom as such. Although there are spaces for it. So when we think about an AI robot, I think that's very different to, for example, having devices that pupils can use for stretch and challenge, for example. So the teachers can be there and they can teach, but it means that there are tools at their disposal. So when there needs to be differentiation, that it's more accessible in a real-time fashion. I think that's what we should be seeing. But unfortunately, as much as I think that teachers shouldn't be replaced, there are schools that I've heard of globally where they are having AI as the prime teacher and the human is the assistant teacher. And I think that is concerning because the education system shouldn't just be about results. It shouldn't just be about an endpoint. It's supposed to be a developmental opportunity for children. And so because of that, there needs to be humans there. There needs to be the people element of it, because otherwise, what are we creating?
Mm, exactly. And that's a deep thought. And I hope more people think about that side of it because I would be like you said, if we have that kind of certain percentage AI education going on, but mainly teachers doing it, I think that's very important for the future, um, which is a really, really interesting topic. So let's talk a bit about how you're working with schools. Potentially, we want to get your kind of message across to policy level in governments as well, right? So what kind of things are you working on at the moment?
So we're looking very much at strategy and framework. So the way that we work is we have a whole host of things that we're doing. So we look at strategy and audits of schools to look at their AI readiness and think about how they could responsibly integrate that. But in also when we're thinking about teaching and learning. So AI is very much not just this is a technological thing that you can use. It's how do you use it responsibly, and also when should you not use it? Because I think that question isn't being asked enough either, is just because you can, does that mean you should?
Mm,
Especially when it comes to young people and also untested technology. So we look at that aspect of it. We also run webinars as well, and we look at children's safety because fundamentally, children in and out of school are grappling with AI. And there is not a lot of support there. And there needs to be more legislation when it comes to safety. Safety should not be an afterthought. It shouldn't be a case of retrospectively legislating something for young people because they've already then had contact at that stage. And that's what's greatly concerning. If an application says we cannot guarantee the material is
mm,
to the appropriate age level, why are we allowing our young people to use it? And if
very.
we can't guarantee the safety of the users, it shouldn't be a case of let's just put it out there and see, and then we'll retrospectively put in safety guardrails. If those guardrails do not exist, it shouldn't be coming out. And that should be government responsibility there to protect the people who are using it. And there needs to be far more legislation about what kind of platforms are allowable and what guardrails they need to put in place before they can enter the market.
Mm. So it sounds like we need the teachers to rally together to be able to talk to the governments and policymakers to have that kind of influence on the tech companies in respect to what you said in regards to safeguard, and then you also using that to kind of shape the policy on how best to educate the next generation, and study things like what are the outcomes, what could happen, and and try to put best practices in place. Like, share a bit more about that.
So I also think, as well as teachers, it needs to be parents as well. When you look at the young people who are interacting. So there was a case, not that long ago when we think about the US and character AI with the young boy that committed suicide because he was engaging with an AI chatbot who was encouraging suicide. And you
Wow.
think there's elements of this where, you know, there needs to be far more protections. And also when it comes to, there's apps, for example, there's schools that have come under fire globally where children have used images from social media and used apps that remove their clothes, for example. So you've got a lot of that. You've got a lot of deep fakes. And there's not that education for young people or for adults either. And I think going forward, that's what's lacking is people need to understand there needs to be a basic AI literacy, and that shouldn't be those who go and seek out the information. That should be available to people as a standard. This is what you need to know, children. This is what you need to know to protect yourselves. To parents, this is how you can keep your children safe in with everything that's going on here. And I think it can't just be looking at teachers, it can't just be young people, it has to be looking at so many different aspects of society. Parents need to be far more involved, and that means there needs to be open communication channels between schools and parents, which isn't always the case when it comes to these things, because schools want to look very certain about what they're doing when it comes to parents. But actually, I think now's the time for people to say, you know, I just don't know. I don't know. What can we learn from each other? This is my experience. What's yours? And building those conversations so that we can truly then evaluate the impact on children.
Hmm. I agree with you there because in the business world we're hearing that loads of people are having conversations around saying, you know what, we don't know what's happening and we can't predict what's happening because it is such a gray area, and people are trying to have conversations around, well, what could happen, how could things change, how can just the way people earn money change as well. But we don't look at the other side of it, like what you've just shared. That kind of stuff is like, hang on a minute, stop worrying about whether the AI is going to take away your jobs or not, but focus on how it's going to impact your children. How is it going to impact things around you in terms of society and culture and things like that? One of the things the other gentleman said when I was interviewing him was about, he spoke about biases, right? And he talked about how it's harder to teach unbiased people, but it's easier to potentially teach AI how not to be biased. So what could happen is that we could teach the AI how not to be biased, and then that could teach it back to us as a next gen kind of, even as a education module, right? So it's interesting because we're seeing this symbiotic thing going on with human and machine at the moment, and it's such a gray area. And I'm so glad that you are actually championing all of this and putting the message out there. And why I think it's very important for you to get your message out there as well. Like, you know, share a bit about your experiences with the kind of school work that you've been doing and where they're struggling or what kind of things are possible for them. What kind of things are happening in that space?
So I think in terms of where a lot of schools in general, as opposed to teachers, are struggling, is being able to find the time, the curriculum space to explore it, but also how far they should. So, for example, you've got schools who are very forward thinking and very kind of innovation driven, who are doing a lot of initiatives, who are embedding it in their curriculums, who are creating new schemes of work, who are doing a lot of training programs when it comes to staff. You've got other schools, however, where you might have a more traditional staff body who don't really want to be using that kind of technology in their spaces, and so there's not so much of a it's just more difficult really to implement there. And then you've got other schools where some schools have devices for pupils and staff, some schools don't have devices for pupils. So again, there's that disparity. And I think that's what's coming across that's so tricky, is that there's no consistency there. And
Mm.
also, there needs to be the question, which I was asked more recently, which is, you know, as schools, do we want consistency or do we want coherence in approach? Because do we actually want everyone to be doing the same, or do we want to have some strict values about how it should be used, and then people exploring within those values in terms of coherency? And actually, after hearing that, I'm far more now a believer of coherency. I don't think there necessarily should be a consistent approach. I think, but there does need to be a values-based coherent approach, not just across schools, but also, you know, across multi-academy trusts, across government initiatives when we think about education. What are our values now? So, you know, there's a lot of talk by the government about how it can save X amount of hours per week, for example, for teachers or anything else. But actually, what are the values when we're using it? Because the only value I've heard currently is, you know, that it has to be human-centered. But there's so many different elements of that needs to be picked apart for people to far better gauge what's going on. And schools are having to interpret this guidance. And actually, it'd be much better if there was a conversation about what these values should be in our education system.
Wow, that's it looks like there's a lot of work to do in that space, right? Because like influencing that space. I mean, what kind of things are you doing, working on at the moment? Because I know you are involved in a lot of things. What are you doing, and what can others do in order to kind of get this message out there?
So what we're doing, we've got panels, for example, so we've got a panel of 20 educators across the south of England who join up, and that's very much an innovation panel where we're able to discuss and basically like thinking shop, as it were. And then as well as that, we do our business, but also we're looking we've also spun up a non-profit as well. And the reason for that is that going through this process, I'm really thinking about the impact on young people, but also their opportunities. And, because there's so much disparity, there are some schools that are forging ahead and some schools where they have innovation programs, and there are some schools where they don't have devices. So where is the opportunity there? So what we've done is we've created a non-profit in which it's a challenge for young people where they are able to enter with the support of their school, and they curate a proposal of how AI can be used to address some sort of societal issue. So whether that be environmental or diversity or cultural erosion, and they will then be allocated mentors, which means that it doesn't take from resources of the schools, they're externally provided, and then the winning team slash individual, their product is actually then built as a proof of concept build. So as lovely as it is getting a certificate, instead we're actually saying have an opportunity to build something here, have an opportunity to actually impact what the future might look like. And all the profits from that will then go towards bridging the digital divide. So whether that's in terms of safety resources or workshops, for example, and that's where this has led to, because we need to give young people an opportunity here. It's all good and well saying this is how you can use it and this is how you can't and this is digital literacy, but actually, how do you want to use it? How do you think it can shape your future? Because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about their choices, their lives, and the technology that's being created today, as much as it will impact ours, when we think about our children, that's where it's going to have a real impact. And why do they not have choices in that?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good and deep question, It's it's almost like one of those things where, like humanity has created this thing now, like the AI, right? And it's down to all of us to kind of contribute and say how best to utilize whatever comes out of it. Because at this moment in time, it's 100% a gray area, right? We just don't know which direction it's going to go into. We don't know which, you know, tech is going to have influence on people. We don't, it's being utilized in every kind of sphere, and we need to come together to have that governance, ethics as well, right? Talk a bit about the kind of ethical side of things, because I think that's quite important. Because if we don't train the AI, if we train it with bad biases and the ethics are not in place, that could be messy as well, right?
Yeah, I think one of the most important ethical issues I find is the fact that AI is a mirror of our society. It is a mirror, and unfortunately, when we think about our society, and I'm talking about our global society here, it is not equitable. And therefore, any data that's trained on that is not equitable. And then we're feeding this back, and it's becoming this terrible echo chamber where I've read articles recently about how it's enabling us to go back in time and entrenching prejudice that we thought we'd got away from. So, for example, when we look at equality and women's rights, for example, when you look at some AI outputs and when it stereotypes males instead of females in certain professions, or when you think about you type in a rural community and it will show a rural community from the 50s. And that's very problematic because actually all the education, all the initiatives that we've been doing in the more recent years to create a more equitable society are now slowly being eroded because we have this technology which is people facing that is then re-embedding this prejudice. And
Mm,
I think that is the biggest issue is people don't understand just how biased it is. And the thing is, people need to understand that AI is not neutral. It is not a neutral thing. It's programmed a certain way. And actually, it's programmed with the Western understanding of knowledge, the Western understanding of life. And so, because of that, if you're going to look at smaller, even if you were to look at, for example, the global majority, it won't have the same information, the same knowledge base. And so, by proxy, we're always going to struggle there because actually there's not that representation.
mm. It's true. I know tech companies are working on that. They're trying to bring like different diverse people into the organization to try to combat that side of it. But you're right, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that side because most of the, I don't know this, you probably have more data on this. Most of the people coding this stuff are, like you said, males, right? So there are going to be inbuilt biases into that as well. So it's that's quite crazy. What about the more of the ethical side and how you can influence local council, governments, and things like that to kind of work more in line with education?
So I think again, it all comes under there should be education initiatives to inform teachers, to inform young people about how they can be using it, and also about the things that it can be creating, whether they're good or bad. I think when it comes to ethics, ethics is very much a movable term dependent on what your knowledge base is. And so there needs to be a foundational knowledge base there in order to understand and really grapple with the ethics that is AI. And because when we think about ethics, it can come under so many things. We could think about bias, we could think about hallucinations and fabrication, we could think about the commercialization of education and whether that's an issue, because to me, that is the commercialization of education is very concerning. But also, we could think about things when we think about ethics and what that's turning you into when we think about cognitive atrophy, for example, and the impact it's having on people and the impact it's having on young people who are not choosing the way they're being educated. And so I think there's a lot of ethics, but it all comes down to understanding and choice. And so I think when it comes to initiatives, when it comes to government, there needs to be more voices that are invited in to have these conversations. But to do that, there needs to be more knowledge shared. And it can't just be pushed in front of this is an efficiency saving and therefore go on and try it out. There needs to be very much a shared knowledge base in terms of what its strengths are, what its limitations are, and some basic guardrails.
Mm-hmm. No, I get that. I get that. It's a very, yeah, very interesting topic because you've got me thinking on a few different things as well, which I hadn't considered. You know, that's great. So, there's several projects that you're involved in. All right, just share a bit about each one of them.
Okay, so when we think about our project, so when we think about AI Edify, for example, so that is very much looking at, as we've seen, our webinars, we're looking at safety initiatives, we're looking at PSHE resources, because that's a fundamental way that young people will have that knowledge. As well as that, I have been working with a number of schools when we're thinking about their strategies, but also when we're thinking about what responsible use looks like, and also working with organizations when we're thinking about exam boards and what plagiarism looks like as well. And I think that's been one that's been particularly tricky, is because our exam system is, I would argue, quite outdated. And the reason why I'm saying that is because there's a lot of assessments where one could argue, what purpose do they have? Because they haven't changed in so long. I was educated in exactly the same way. I think it's very much a case of, previous generations, again, the education system, it hasn't really moved very much, but we have so much technology now, and the way that we could change it the way we can impact learning has changed so much. And so there's a lot of conversations about that. And then, as I'd mentioned as well, the non-profit, so all about giving opportunity, but not just about opportunity to those who are able to be innovative, but also bridging that divide. We can't have a society where you have the few who are forging ahead and then the vast majority who are essentially struggling to grapple with not only how they should use it, but actually what it is. Because it's the global majority that are going to be so impacted and pushed further behind in this journey. And so I have a lot of conversations about that. And that's why the nonprofit began, because it was all about how do we have an equitable society when we think of digital technology.
Mm-hmm. So those are the two projects. There was a third one that you were working on as well?
No, those two.
Those two. Okay, cool. All right. And okay, so if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best thing for them to do?
So the best thing to do is to go onto the website. So it's www.aiedify.com, or on LinkedIn as well, because apparently that's where I live now. So they tend to be the best options. And then for the nonprofit, it's ICAI, which is www.the-icai.org.
Okay, cool. And if you were to, if you were going to share kind of key points and outcomes that you would like to see, if you said students go do this, like, and you said teachers go do this, like, what would you say to them? Like, what's your message for the students, I suppose? And what's your message for the teachers, and what's your message for the parents? Because I think those are the three key things, with what you're sharing.
I think it would be combined, and I think the advice to all of them is to speak to one another, have an open communication, and say, how is this being used by parents? What is your understanding of pupil use? When we think about the children, how are you using it? What are you finding it helpful for? What problems have you seen? How far are you aware of it is embedded in your lives? Because when we think about AI, currently we're thinking about generative AI, but what about things such as, using maps or using Netflix or using Alexa or anything else? It's still there. And so, how far do children actually understand? And so, my advice would be have the conversations, speak about it, ask questions. And if you don't know, ask more questions. Because I think that's the only way we're going to do it is by doing a unified approach. And we can't be doing this in silo. We can't just have AI for education and then AI at home, then AI for, when we think about social impacts of it or having companions, as it were. It's so embedded and it's so enmeshed that we all need to be doing this together. So my takeaway from this would be having those conversations, speak to each other. And when you don't know, just ask those questions because frankly, none of us know how this is going to end up. And we don't know what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time.
No, I think that's very important takeaway there is because we don't know. If people are like, this ain't a time to be egotistic or pride in what they have that pride in what they're doing and actually be open and say, you know what, we don't know what's going on. And we need to come together to say, how do we shape the direction of this, right? So from what I'm taking away from this as well, I think for the teachers, they shouldn't have a worry. I don't think they need to worry that AI is going to take their jobs away. I don't think that's going to be the case, right? Not for a very long time, right? And I think even if we do, it's like you said, there's probably going to be some sort of 50-50 split. Like you might have an AI assistant in the classroom, but you still have that teacher and the human element of it. So I think it's more a case of how it evolves for the teachers, right? Students, it's an interesting one because for them, it's like the safeguard. I think that's key. It's like how do we safeguard what they get into because there's a whole culture there, right? There's a whole culture that maybe the teachers are not even aware of what's going on with the students and the kids and how they're utilizing AI. I mean, there was that brilliant program recently. I can't remember what it called, Adolescent, I think it was, or something. It was that was a very interesting take. I never knew. Like I looked at it and thought, oh my goodness, like what else is going on like this that could influence people in a negative way. Um, so yeah, it's important. I mean, I appreciate your time and appreciate your feedback on this. I think what you're doing is very important. So thank you for taking the time out of this, and we can expand. There's so much stuff we can talk about, but we have that thing called time, right? So once again, if people want to reach out to you, what's the best thing for them to do?
So going on www.aiedify.com or going on to www.the-icai.org or just reaching out to me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, people, I highly recommend that you do reach out to Bianca. I think what she's working on is a very important topic. So just get behind, share what she's on talking about, share it with the world because it is definitely important. And Bianca, thank you very much for your time. And on that note, I think everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.